Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioral change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioral experts across industries and organizations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviorist, Nick Hobson.
Mariel Beasley is a co-founder of Duke's Common Sense Lab, a nonprofit research hub whose aim is to increase the financial well-being for low to moderate income people living in the U.S. Muriel is also a senior applied researcher at the Center for Advanced Hindsight. Her previous work experience includes Boulder County Housing and Human Services, Peace Corps, Dominican Republic, and Nagle and Associates, a consulting firm for nonprofits and charitable foundations. Muriel holds a Master of Public Policy degree from Duke University, where she also teaches a course on applying behavioral insights to municipal policy. Muriel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
So I'm gonna get us right into the weeds right off the bat. I hope that's okay.
Great. Start hard. That's definitely the advice in behavioral science.
There you go. I have to, right? So, and this might be a bit of a winding preamble, but I promise there's a question in there somewhere. It's just a reason for me to vent, I think. But so humor me, if you will.
Sure.
There's something I guess on the top of my mind right now, and this is because it's been coming up in conversations just very recently in the last week or two in the behavioral community and around Toronto, mostly where I am, and at Rotman Business School. And this is the question of the strengths of our effects that we find and whether they're even replicable, given how tricky it is to do our work in field settings in the wild. And also given that there's always these changes in context and there's questions of, how do we scale something to the broader community or to the bigger aspect of the organization. So all that we know, like, because we're scientists, we know that science is a game of many losses and few wins. Many of our experiments will quote unquote fail, or there'll be the negative results with these. And then every now and then we'll get a big win, a positive result that confirms that initial set of hypotheses that we had, and hopefully moves the needle in the direction that we needed to, or that we would like it to go. But I come from, in my academic past, we were in the heyday of the replication crisis, and there seemed to be this overemphasis on positive results, which led to, the file drawer problem and all these things. So I wonder if you have thought about this, and I'm seeing similar patterns in practice now, such that there seems to be an overemphasis on positive results. And so it makes us question, okay, what are we doing with all these negative results or failed experiments that are most definitely happening? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this, and if you guys have any sort of way of handling this at Common Sense.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, like, you raised a lot of real challenges and I think concerns in the field as a whole. And so there's kind of a couple of pieces in there. So I'm going to kind of pull out and just address them sort of individually. But to start first with that last piece about, part of science and experimentation is like having failures. And because if you're not, if like everything you try works, that also sort of suggests that you're not trying interesting things. You're not pushing the envelope. You're not really sort of trying to understand the bounds of what works, when things work, when things don't work, when they fall apart, et cetera. So I actually think like having lots of negative results or sort of not negative results, but lots of failure to reject the null, if we want to, use the terminology. I think that's a good thing, right? I think that if everything was of positive effects in the directions that we expected them, that would mean that we're not doing interesting things. We're not learning. Mm-hmm. And I think, how do we though make sure that it's not that we actually do treat those those p-values greater than 0.05? How do we make sure that we're treating those as learnings and just as important to the process as when a p-value comes out as less than 0.05? I think that's a real challenge within, not just within academia, but also in sort of that practical application of science and testing and learning. Because if if you only publish what works and you only talk about what works, then people will try to just replicate that, in the world, which is good, but also it can overinflate effect sizes. It can sort of inflate expectations around like what behavioral science can do. And what it also means is that people will continue to test things that don't work because they don't realize that actually we've also learned that those things don't work. And so at Common Sense, we do an annual report every year that is very much intended. It's accessible. It's very much intended for lay audiences. It's intended for practitioners. It's intended for people that run credit unions and nonprofits that are focused on financial well-being. And we make sure that we actually include write-ups. Every project that we do has like a 2-page write-up that is sort of an explanation of what we ran, images of the materials that we did and our results. And we make sure that whether it was a positive result or whether it was actually turns out it didn't work or turns out it backfired, everything gets sort of the same amount of real estate in our annual report.
Great.
Yeah. And because I think to your point, like if we don't talk about what doesn't work, people will continue to try it, because the reason why we tried it is because we all had intuition that it would work. We all had sort of background information or, building on other research that had been done in a lab or in a field to say this should work. So that when it doesn't, that's also really important. And you have to talk about that because I promise you, someone else is trying it.
And that transparency is key. And like you said, saves not just your own organization or your own team, but others who are doing similar work in similar contexts, or even in different contexts and different work. It still is going to be relevant, and it's still going to be helpful for them in their decision-making process of what interventions to try out, as opposed to just not, having that intuition, but just having that and nothing else beyond that intuition.
Yeah,
so I think that transparency is key, and that's great. You have that annual report, and I'll be sure to link to that. And
yep.
I hope there's more organizations, be they in nonprofit or in the private sector, that follow similar practices.
Yeah, and I think actually also there's a nice, it's albeit small but hopefully growing movement also in academia and with journals, where there are some journals that are accepting articles or basically accepting papers before the results have been collected. And I think that's actually a really, really good positive move for the field, because it says, hey, this is an interesting question. You have a great way to approach it to answer this question. And it's just as interesting if it doesn't work as if it does work.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and I've heard those initiatives too. And to the extent that what happens in academia first, we see the echoes of it later in practice, which I think does happen often. That's a good sign, because that will trickle into the work that we do as practitioners. That's really cool.
Yeah, and hopefully it'll also become like at conferences, there'll be a whole track on null results, or conference posters that are all sort of, this is the grouping of null results. It'd be great to see that sort of become more and more just normal and natural to talk about. But I think the important thing means that, we have to be making sure that we're designing studies such that we are also learning from those null results, and that it's not like a null result happens and we said, well, we don't know why we got the null result. It could be because it didn't, theoretically it didn't. And that's the challenge, is that there's a ton of reasons why something doesn't work. But making sure that we're designing our studies in such a way to be able to isolate at least some of those factors.
Yeah. The one line I think I would hear from one of my mentors is like, the absence of evidence does not mean there's evidence of absence. It just means that you didn't measure something.
Exactly.
and the next time you got to figure out what might be a better metric or a better outcome variable to measure. And it's a tricky thing. Being scientists of humans. Very good. That's excellent. So now to make something a little bit easier for you, you have a really interesting backstory. That is, I might even say, not as sort of non-typical, at least from my world. So at what point did you realize BE, or applied behavioral science, was the thing? Like, when did you drink the Kool-Aid? When did you know that you'd be throwing yourself and your work, like using behavioral science to throw your work in policy, charity, and nonprofit, and the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's a good question. I think for me, it is also one of those things where I reflect back on the work that I did and realize that a lot of the things, even before I had names for it, I was still very much kind of using a behavioral science approach. And so, in Peace Corps, like some of the projects that I was working on was really all about also figuring out how within a process are there places where that process breaks down, which is essentially, based on human behavior, and figuring out how do I sort of make it easier for people to do the right thing? How do I make it harder for people to do the wrong thing? How do I, simplify complex processes? How do I provide timely reminders in that process? And so I think my brain has sort of always functioned in that way to figure out like, okay, well, what is the process here that we're trying to move people through? And this is essentially the same process that we now use at Common Sense Lab to sort of move the needle on sort of these, but now we're able to bring in and say, oh, actually, like we might think there's some hyperbolic discounting happening here. And we now have like terms for some of this stuff. And it was in, I would say, so starting in Peace Corps, I one of the major projects that I worked on was trying to help folks get birth certificates, and that's a really complex process. And so that was also, as mentioned, that was like a place where essentially the way that I approached it is very much the way behavioral scientists would approach something, and they'd say, okay, well, what are all the steps that somebody does to do this? Where is this hard? Where is this difficult? Where can I make it easier, either by changing incentives? Where can I make it easier by reducing friction? Et cetera. And so, and it really actually wasn't until I started at the center, actually, that I started really getting the words for it, and more of that background research. So so that was in Peace Corps, and then I came to policy school because I essentially in Peace Corps, I kind of was like, man, some of these things just need bigger changes than just people delivering services on the ground. So then I went to policy school, and that's when I like really focused also in like the evaluation piece to it. And I think what I really loved was like from policy school was this sort of rapid learning and randomized control trials and rigorous evaluations to figure out what's working, what's not working. And so then that was sort of the piece to behavioral science that I like really anchored on. It was like, yes, this is what I want to do. I want to use sort of this rapid learning in rigorous ways to be able to improve processes and services. And so that was actually then the aspect of the work at the Center for Advanced Hindsight, which is Dan Ariely's research group here at Duke, that I was sort of most attracted to when I joined the lab. And I actually, in my interview with Dan, I remember Dan saying, the characteristics that we need of somebody, working at the center is, we need somebody who's part teacher, because it's, part of this job is, particularly in an applied research setting, is teaching people about some of these concepts and allowing them to understand and reflect on where they can see these concepts happening and then how to sort of address them and deal with them. So we need somebody who's sort of part teacher. We need somebody who understands experimental design and research and data. And we need somebody who is also part consultant, who's able to kind of go into somebody else's space and identify places where they could make, some of these sort of marginal improvements to sort of align to the objectives that they want, but that's also good for people. And he said, and then of course, the last piece that we need somebody who also has a deep understanding of behavioral science. And I was very fortunate in that Dan said, if you've got 4 out of the 5, that's great. And we can teach you the 5th. And so when I joined the lab, a lot of sort of my beginning, and I was in grad school, I had TA'd for microecon. So I had some of that microecon, background and grounding and such. But I was very fortunate in that coming into the job, Dan said, we'll spend time and energy and effort and development on sort of helping ground. If you can read an academic paper and learn it, we can teach it to you. So I was just very fortunate. And I know that not every jobs are that way. So I did a lot of my deep behavioral science learning just on the job.
And it's a theme I'm hearing more and more. And I think I was ignorant to that possible trajectory into this world because of my own was like coming from formal academia, having that training, getting that domain expertise, and then using it to go into practice. But there's a lot of folks now who I talk to, even younger people who are coming out of university or sort of in transition, and they don't have that formal training, but they do have those other four things, or maybe three things that you listed in your interview with Dan. And just to go back to one of those seems to be maybe to some degree like a personality trait. So you in your work with the Peace Corps, you said you were sort of essentially doing human-centric service design. So you were thinking of the human and the friction points and the decision processes along the way. Do you attribute that to just that was your personality, or did you have some training in undergrad, or is that just the way you thought about the world?
I think that has generally just been the way that I think about the world. I often think that if I didn't like have this job and do what I do now, what would I do? And I think that I would be, I think that I would actually be an engineer, which is also sort of about breaking things into these small components and figuring out if I do this, what happens to that, and thinking through, and more of like a systems or process engineer. And so I think that's just sort of always been the way that my brain works is I sort of say, man, this is really complex. How do I break this into smaller pieces? And then what happens if I do this to this piece? And what happens if I do that to that piece? And that's just sort of always the way that fortunately my brain has worked. It suits me very well for this. It does not suit me well for other things. But
well, we have our strengths and our weaknesses, right?
That's right. That is right.
And the way that I've come to think of it now is you can have somebody who has that sort of default personality trait, those skill sets, who doesn't have like the PhD, the formal training. Mm-hmm. And then opposite to that, you can have the person who has a formal training who doesn't have that sort of default personality style. Yep. And if it were me, if I were building a research hub, or if I were building a team within an organization, I would most definitely opt for number one. I think that's the much stronger predictor in terms of what outcomes we want in a person who's applying behavioral insights.
Yeah. And yeah, certainly in an applied lab, it's a huge benefit. I mean, you do want to make sure, I think this is, we have folks on our team that have PhDs and we have folks who are more squarely rooted in academia and sort of the more traditional route. We also have people who come from the consulting world and then have transferred over, and we're teaching them behavioral science here, but they already kind of know how to work with external folks and get them to try new things and talk about complex processes with them. But we really think you actually, that's one of the benefits that we have, I think, is that we have both. Because I also see a lot of applied behavioral science research shops that, they don't read any of the papers. They read, they've read all the popular books, which is great and helpful. But it's basically that they know enough to be dangerous. Right. So that basically means they know what social proof is, and they know that social proof is really, a powerful motivator. But they don't actually, they haven't read the papers enough to know there's places where it fails. And to understand that that just saying, 70% of people do this doesn't always actually then change behavior, that there's all kinds of other nuances to it. And so I think that so there's a lot of people that just they listen to podcasts, which are wonderful sources of information. Don't get me wrong.
Contributing to that.
No, but I mean, I think it's if your job is very much also around is to be implementing behavioral science, you have to also be reading the papers, because the papers have, while they're sometimes dry and difficult to get through, they have all of the caveats that get dropped when you're trying to create a soundbite about a study. And I just see so many, particularly when just organizations that if they have nobody who's seeped in academia in their group, it's very easy to just kind of be throwing out the terms on a high level, not without the deep understanding of let's talk about when it's better to use an injunctive versus a descriptive norm, and sort of understanding the context and which one fits better. So I think you still have to have some sort of this rooting to academia. But I agree that if your team is all academics, then I think it also can be very, very difficult, because academics have, very much been trained to, come up with a theory and test, and then test that theory and test that mechanism. And so what we've found is that sometimes it's very difficult for academics to, instead of approach and say, what is the problem and what of these tools is best suited to solve that problem? Instead, it says, this is a problem. Can the tool that I have and have spent, the last 10 years honing, will that tool address this problem? Rather than, is this the best tool to address it across, a variety of them? So we just find that it's sometimes hard for academics to think flexibly across, across projects and across potential solutions.
Because that's that's a PhD, right? It's just like
Exactly.
drilling down into this one little thing for years and years on end. And there's this really great, I remember I came across it a few years ago. It's like this little animation of a person who's going through their formal education, and it's represented as I'll try to find it and put it in the links. It's sort of represented as a circle, and the circle is sort of the theoretical complete body of knowledge that we can understand as humans. And we sort of begin from the center of the circle, we begin to drill out towards the outside. And that's like undergrad. And then we get a master's or a PhD if you continue in that. And you really like puncture that one little 0.5% of the complete body of knowledge and you really zoom in. And then when you sort of finish that, you think you know everything, but you've forgotten that there's the rest of the 99.9% of the circle that exists out there.
Exactly.
So that was a good reminder to me. And what was hard for me is I almost had to betray some of my training and some of the sentiments that I had picked up as an academic. I remember in writing papers and designing studies and collecting data and doing all those things in the lab, so much was nuance. So much was about nuance. So much was about splitting hairs. So much was about adding those caveats that you said. The qualifiers, especially in the general discussion, is like, well, we found this, but we have to be considerate of this, or we have to be cautious of being too conclusive in our findings. I find that there has to be some of that has to be let go in practice. You can't just go on and on and on and find nuance in everything. At some point, you kind of have to make a decision and act.
Yeah, and particularly from a behavioral science perspective, we know that detailed information is hard for people to comprehend. You have to simplify it. You have to put it in meaningful terms. Otherwise, it's no one will remember it. It won't sort of be meaningful. They won't know how to actually interpret that information. And it's a real challenge because there is a little bit of a trade-off between, accuracy and comprehensibility.
Exactly.
And when we think about our role is to, yes, we want to make sure that we're telling people true things, but it also we also have to be deliberate about how do we help people understand these results. And it is a constant battle.
I like that as a trade-off, especially when our partners and clients and external stakeholders are often non-scientists. So that comprehensibility piece is key. And I'm really curious. I like talking about
Nick,
talent and how we put these teams together.
I think I've lost you.
If you wouldn't mind just going back to your team at Common Sense, you said you have this mix.
Are you there, Nick?
How do you divvy the work? My
sense is that this will get cut out of the
PhD
podcast.
Academics
still recording me.
Sit in the same room as the former Deloitte consultants, or are they on their own and come together at different stages of the project? How does that look in your team?
Yeah, so we try to really think about balanced teams, and so we usually have about 3 people or so on a particular research project team, and sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3, and they are sort of responsible for the project management and pushing the project forward, and basically everybody across the lab is participates in that. And then that smaller group, it's also their responsibility to tap into the larger group and the larger team when they've identified that they need a particular skill set. So, for instance, there might be a team that has, where maybe, they have a really strong, partner management person on it and a really strong, design, person with a design background. So thinking through about how something looks and feels and et cetera. And maybe they also have somebody on that team who's a very strong data analyst. But maybe what they don't have is that the deep behavioral science, the real conceptual stuff. Although I will note that we sort of do ongoing training and development for everyone on our team. That's really just, we think our edge is on keeping up with the literature. And so we make sure that everybody has time as part of their job to be reading papers and going to conferences and sort of keeping up with stuff. But all the same, so then they'll bring in other folks to either join meetings with partners, or they'll take and come back to the larger group to do, okay, let's do some deep dive. We're going to lay out, here's the problem. We're going to sort of outlay all of this to the larger Common Sense Lab team, and then have some of the folks that maybe have the deeper behavioral science background or theoretical stuff be able to come in and sort of add to their thoughts, designs, experiment, and to get at some of the more nuanced pieces to it. And then they'll take that back to the partners. And so we keep really small teams on driving projects forward because more cooks in the kitchen just slow things down, take time. But then they come back out and leverage the full, the full skill set of the teams at various points across the project.
Just to zoom out a bit and to talk about sort of money spending and financial related behaviors. I guess as marketplaces and workplaces and home life and all of these things are changing at a really quite a rapid pace, what negative impact has it had on people's ability to be financially responsible and to have a certain financial health, especially those who are at risk socioeconomic situations? Do you think we're putting now too much onus on the individual? And given what we know about certain shortcomings of the individual, do you think there should be more attention and more onus on organizations or governments?
Yes. That's the short answer is yes.
Okay, let's move on.
Done. Next question. No. So you exactly right. So the history of sort of the systems within the United States, particularly around financial security, et cetera, has shifted more and more responsibility and onus on the individual. And it used to be that companies had a strong sense of financial responsibility to their employees. And that really shifted as it became more and more a priority of companies to be beholden not to their employees and not even to their customers, but to their shareholders. Mm-hmm. Which often meant that they figured out ways to reduce costs for the company as ways to sort of maximize profits. And essentially what that has meant is that you see more and more, now we've switched from most people having access to a defined benefit retirement plan, which is, more of a pension, to now very few people have access to a defined benefit. Now it's defined contribution. Mm-hmm. And so, you have to be putting money into a retirement, and then whatever happens in the market is what happens with your retirement payouts. And I think we also see this in the healthcare space, where it's sort of, instead of, because of the rising costs of healthcare, companies are choosing to do basically, instead of increasing premiums for employees, they're just increasing deductibles, which again also is sort of putting a lot of sort of responsibility on the individual end user, and that is really undermining people's sort of financial stability, because even people who are fully insured with their employer are facing rising healthcare costs that they can't afford. And so I think that there's this combination of, more and more responsibility placed on the end user. And part of this is, the solutions that we have focused on around how to deal with financial stability or financial instability, as the case often is, have also been solutions that are focused on the individual, right? So the most common thing that people are trying to do to improve people's financial health and financial outcomes is financial education, which basically says there's nothing wrong with the system and the system that people and what people are operating on. It's the entirely reason why people aren't doing well is because they don't know better. And if we just give them information, that will change their behavior. They will make better choices, despite the fact that they're actually operating environments where it's harder and harder and harder to make good decisions.
Do you suspect it's like sorry to hold you?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's what you're calling it, this like the responsibility on the end user. And taking it away from organizations or taking it away from government. Does that align with the greater emphasis put on like sort of individual sovereignty and taking care of myself and what's mine and I can do it? It seems we're getting more and more in that direction.
Yeah. And I think now we're sort of starting to see a pendulum swing back around like, actually, no, some of these things are a responsibility of government and companies. And there is a little bit more of this emphasis on like, doing well by doing good, or some doing good by doing well. I don't remember the order of those things, but that basically says like, no, actually we do need to take care of people. And so I think we're starting to see that shift back. But I think, we have such a strong underlying narrative in the US about sort of individual sovereignty, choice, freedom, liberty, like all of these concepts that, and I also think like even among people who are, really deeply care about folks who aren't doing well, it also almost feels like it is disrespectful to them to say that like this isn't like that it to say that they're it feels like we're saying, oh, people are stupid, that they're like moving through these environments and so we want to empower them to make better decisions. And it feels terrible to say, no, actually what we want to do is remove choice, and we want to remove some of that individual liberty. And it just feels uncomfortable to people. It's just like not their intuition about like being respectful to other people, but also around our narrative about what it means to be an American, what it means to be human, and your ability to chart your own path and your own destiny.
Yeah. And imagine that narrative can also get in the wrong hands and become, filled with hate. To spin a certain story about people who are in, low to low SES situations.
Very much, right? I mean, it's like, and there are these like places where these narratives clash, right? So you've got a lot of places where now we talk a lot about, social determinants of health, and that, we talk a lot about how the zip code that you're born in has a ton to do with your likelihood of success. The status of your parents has a lot to do with your financial outlook as well. So there's, we understand that also on a big kind of global level, but it still feels like it's sort of this restriction of individual choice if we basically say that people also can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This isn't about making good choices or bad choices. It's essentially about like, we just haven't designed systems and environments that are conducive to better behavior. And so you can do, and I mean, it's one of those things that's like so frustrating for me. This like, everybody's like, oh, we just need to like empower people to make better financial decisions. And I'm like, no, we need to like hold financial institutions accountable for creating bad systems. And we need to create, systems that actually encourage people to save, and to that actually encourage people to pay back their debt faster, and to pay lower interest rates on that. And it's not just, well, it's up to the individual to find the lender that will give them the lowest interest rate. It's like, no, we need to like actually do more to navigate people through these systems, because they're and the challenge is that they're getting more and more complex. As when we talk not just about this sort of shifting of responsibility back to the individual, but technology has been an incredible thing for human advancement, et cetera, but it's also made the world incredibly complex, and there's now a million different, like from a positive financial space, there's a million different products to be trying to choose from and understand and make the right decision on. There's a ton of, not just then within products, there's also a ton of different providers. It's no longer just financial institutions. There's now, tech companies that have never been in financial services are now also in financial services. There's bad actors that look like potentially good actors in cases. And there's, rampant fraud. Like it's become an incredibly complex space to navigate in. And in this like fear of taking away people's liberty, making recommendations for people that might not be the absolute best thing that they could do if they knew if they only made the decision for themselves. And so there's just a lot of reluctance to help people navigate through that complexity in a way that's helpful for people.
And I've never, I'm glad we're talking about this, because I've never thought of the sort of underlying philosophy of behavioral insights and behavioral change, which is humans, given our rationalities and given our evolved set of cognitions and emotions, we don't know, or we don't know what to do, what's often best for us. And we need to put the responsibility back on, businesses or organizations and institutions to help us along, given the certain shortcomings of our psychology. And yet I can see, even like,
it's a hard statement to make at the same time, right? Because it's like
Exactly.
You're all of a sudden telling people that they don't know what's best for them.
Exactly.
And like, that sounds like you're undermining people's, like their abilities and who they are. And like, you're sort of suggesting that they're, making bad decisions. And it's like, no, they're just operating in bad designs.
Yeah, and I could see, like, obviously I don't see this, but I could see like a hardcore, like, libertarian, but like, behavioral science is just a bunch of commies, like.
Well, and this was really, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein really kind of coming up with this whole libertarian paternalism that, was essentially as a way to basically say, no, we are, we want to respect individual liberty and the ability to choose, which is that libertarian piece. But also we're going to, at the same time, try to create environments that are more conducive to better decisions. And people can always choose not to participate in it, et cetera. And that element of choice has always been an important piece to it. And that essentially has become sort of the nudge culture. And it is very much trying to sort of wed these two pieces. But I think it's tough. I think that it's hard for both sides, both like, bleeding heart people to, and I say that as being one of those people. So it's all in kindness, that like, it's just really hard to take the stance to say that people don't know what's right for them. And, like, empowering them to make the right decision for themselves is probably one of the best ways to get them to not do anything. Because it's, like the world is just too complex. And
you know what it reminds me of, like, people when we talk about the paternalism, we talk about the nudging and some of the discomfort around it, and when nudging becomes shoving and these sorts of things. And the counter argument, what I see as a sort of an easy rebuttal to that is, like, a person might think that they're operating in the world, making their own decisions out of their own volition. And it's like, no, you're being, whether you know it or like it or not, you're being quote unquote nudged all the time. So let's build systems. Let's have these nudges or these things designed in the environment and these different processes that will actually influence you in a positive or a good way. Because you're always being influenced by the environment, whether you like it or not.
Right, very much. And like, we often, like, we say, it's like, our whole point is that behavioral science has demonstrated the importance of the environment, right? In shaping decisions and choices and outcomes. And there is no absence of environment. And I think that's what we like to emphasize a lot, like with our team, is that there's no absence of environment. There's not really a neutral choice. It's not either that you choose to nudge or you don't nudge. It's either that you nudge deliberately or you do it just haphazardly.
Exactly. Yeah.
And haphazard means that in many cases, you're actually hurting people rather than helping them, because you're providing a million disclosures. You are trying to give them every possible option that they, to help them figure out what's best for them. And you're not actually helping them structure those choices in meaningful ways. You're not actually sort of providing good rules of thumb and shortcuts and heuristics to operate through that space.
And ironically, the haphazard version is what the person feels they like is coming out of their own volition.
Right.
And they don't necessarily recognize what's going on. That's very, very interesting. I know we're running out of time. I have one more question.
Yeah.
It's called the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm, that I ask all my guests. And so I'm going to ask you as well. It is, we have a lot of problems in our world we know about, and they need to be fixed. Where do you see behavioral science and behavioral insights playing a role in helping fix one of those, whatever is you see as the big problem?
Yeah. Oh man. It's where to start. There's so many. I think. I mean, obviously, I'm deep in the world of financial decisions, and I think that this is finance is a space that really like percolates to everywhere else in our lives, and so financial stress is one of the largest sources of stress, which then leads to sort of it increases poor health outcomes, or leads to poor health outcomes. It leads to you're like less likely to actually be able to perform well in school and in other places that are really important to getting ahead. It causes stress within relationships and within families. And it, so obviously I think that's a big piece of it, but I actually think that and this is probably because it's just top of mind at the moment. But I actually also see behavioral science being incredibly important in and like the understanding of how humans make decisions and shape behavior. I think that we're going to see more and more work in the policy arena, and not just on how to create policy, like not just like on the implementation of policy, but actually on better understanding in the US particularly on what are the implications of behavioral science, particularly around, in-group, out-group bias and, and social norms and things like that for the actual creation of policy, and how do we keep sort of a democracy functioning as we sort of better understand behavioral science. And I think that there's an incredible amount of room for behavioral science to help deal with how do we basically keep the foundations of our functioning, government and media and et cetera, like afloat and alive. That's particularly top of mind at the moment.
Yeah. I can understand why. These culture wars rage on in particular in the U.S., but in the Western world generally. I've heard this talked about in conversations with others as well, that behavioral science, social psychology, sort of in particular, seems to be a place we need to draw on and glean some insights from to find some solutions, because I think we're in desperate need of them right now.
Yeah, and I think that without better understanding just the interplay between the tribalism and like we're just not going to be able to address the challenges around like distrusting of facts. We're not going to be able to it's just going to continue to become this incredible polarizing space within the United States. And we need to better understand how do we sort of bridge that. And I think there's behavioral science and social psychology, as you mentioned, is ripe for that opportunity.
Yeah. Well, we remain hopeful and optimistic, right?
Very much.
Well, this was great. I feel like we dove in and then we zoomed back out and then we dove in again, and I think we covered lots of ground that no doubt listeners will be really fascinated to hear about. So, Mariel, thank you so much for coming on.
Great, thanks, Nick.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.